Grant Mercer trusted two things in this world: his instincts, sharpened across 30 years of federal law enforcement, and his Dutch shepherd, Flint. A dog that had bitten 3 people in the past 4 months and shown zero remorse about any of them. So when the quiet, forgettable physical therapist pressed 2 fingers against Flint's sternum in the dead of a Montana night, and the dog sat down like a soldier receiving a direct order, Grant understood, with cold and absolute clarity, that whoever Audrey Kell really was, she had not come to his isolated ranch to fix his spine. 4 months earlier, a car bomb had done what 11 years of working RICO cases against the Salazar narco network had failed to do. It had nearly killed Grant Mercer. The device had been rigged beneath the rear axle of his FBI-issued Suburban, detonated remotely at 7 Tires 14 on a Tuesday morning in the parking structure of the Portland field office. 3 members of his task force team died in the blast. Grant survived with a shattered pelvis, a reconstructed L3 vertebra, and permanent nerve damage to his left hand that made it curl slightly inward, like a question mark he couldn't unwrite. His daughter, Rachel, had wanted him moved to a rehabilitation facility in Portland. His attorney, Nelson Cray, the man who had handled Grant's estate, his retirement accounts, and Rachel's college trust for 18 years, had arranged something different. A privately owned property in the Bitterroot Valley of rural Montana, 60 acres of timber and pasture hemmed in by the Sapphire Mountains. Cray described it as therapeutic, isolated enough to rest, close enough to the highway to reach a hospital if necessary. What Cray had not mentioned was that the nearest neighbor was 11 miles away, or that cellular signal required standing at a precise spot on the north porch where 2 towers competed for a connection, or that the property's driveway gate could be rammed through by any vehicle with enough momentum. Grant had noticed these things. He was a federal agent. He noticed things. He also noticed that since the bombing, Flint had become almost unbearable. The dog had been a scent and evidence detection specialist through his working years with the FBI, trained for exactness and discipline. Retirement had softened him into a loyal, moderately affectionate companion. The bombing had rewired him back into something harder. He slept at the foot of Grant's hospital bed and tracked every person who entered the room with the flat, assessing attention of a dog who had decided the world was dangerous and was prepared to enforce that assessment personally. The first 3 home health aides Nelson Cray had arranged through his referral agency lasted a combined 9 days. None of them had technically been bitten, but 2 had come close enough that their agencies had pulled them without asking questions. Audrey Kell arrived on a gray Monday morning in late November, driving a 10-year-old Subaru Outback with a cracked side mirror. She was 29, slight, with dark brown hair pulled back in a ponytail so unassuming it barely registered. She wore a faded green zip-up fleece over navy scrubs and carried a standard PT supply bag and a small cooler, she said, held cold therapy packs. Her paperwork listed 6 years of outpatient rehabilitation experience and a referral from Sentinel Home Care, the same agency that had sent the previous 3 aides. She stood in the doorway of the master bedroom and looked at Flint without flinching. Flint looked back at her, the hair along his spine lifting in a slow ridge, a sound building in his chest that wasn't quite a growl yet. It was more of a warning, a test. Audrey didn't retreat. She didn't hold her hand out for the dog to sniff, the way civilians always did. She simply held still and dropped her gaze, not to the floor in submission, but slightly down, and to the side, the way a handler would, the way someone would who understood that direct eye contact from a stranger reads as aggression in a working dog's nervous system. Flint's ridge settled slowly. He didn't accept her. But he stopped threatening her. He sat and watched her with the particular attention he reserved for things he hadn't categorized yet. Grant watched the whole exchange from his bed and said nothing. She checked his wound sites, assessed his range of motion, and prescribed 3 exercises he could complete without leaving the mattress. She logged his vitals with an efficiency that came not from enthusiasm, but from a routine so deeply internalized it no longer required attention. Then she settled into the armchair in the corner with a medical chart and a cup of coffee, black, which she had made herself without asking, and she read. She didn't check her phone once in 3 hours. He bites, Grant said, testing her. Audrey looked up from her chart. Most dogs with blast exposure trauma do. She went back to reading. She knew about blast exposure trauma for a physical therapist who treated human patients. Grant filed it away. The first 2 weeks of Audrey Kell felt like watching someone perform a convincing version of an ordinary person. She arrived each morning at 7, left each afternoon at 5, and completed her work with a competence that was, on its own, unremarkable. It was the margins that didn't fit. She never sat with her back to the door. Not once, not even in the kitchen when she was making coffee, and the entry was directly behind her. She always angled her chair, or stood with her side to the counter, so both exits stayed in her peripheral field. When a logging truck hit a pothole out on the county road and the impact shook the windows, her eyes moved immediately to the front door. Not upward, not outward, not in the vague civilian alarm of someone startled by a loud noise. She looked at the door. She assessed the entry point. She knew where every window was in the house by the end of day 1. Grant could see it in the slight automatic adjustment of her trajectory when she crossed a room with a window at her back. She wasn't paranoid, she was precautionary. There was a difference, and Grant had spent enough of his career living in the precautionary register to recognize it in someone else. Flint's behavior with her settled into something stranger than hostility. The dog didn't like her, but he didn't dislike her either. He tracked her through every room with the focused, professional attention he'd once given to forensic evidence caches, as if she were something that needed to be cataloged, cross-referenced, eventually resolved. Grant understood the feeling. It was the middle of the 3rd week when the thing happened that changed everything. He had asked her to bring his phone charger from the kitchen. It was late, close to 10 o'clock, the ranch entirely dark beyond the windows, a November wind pressing against the glass with a low, intermittent moan. Flint was asleep at the foot of the bed, twitching slightly in whatever chase his damaged nervous system was running. Audrey was gone less than a minute when Flint launched himself off the bed. There was a shadow moving at the bedroom window, a doe that had wandered close to the house, her body briefly backlit by the motion sensor light on the north side. But Flint didn't know it was a deer. Flint knew only that something large had moved in the dark, outside the glass. And in the 4 months since the bombing, large things moving in the dark had one meaning. He hit the window at a dead sprint, 75 pounds of Dutch Shepherd, barking so hard his whole body rocked with it. His claws scrabbled at the sill. He was fully gone, full combat arousal, the kind of state that takes minutes to descend from and can turn into a bite on the first warm body that tries to intervene. The bedroom door swung open. Audrey stepped in. Grant was trying to push himself upright, reaching for the call bar, watching his dog lose what was left of his composure. He opened his mouth. He never got the chance. Audrey crossed the room in 6 steps. She didn't call the dog's name. She didn't grab him. She dropped to one knee directly beside him, a position that would have been reckless for anyone without exact knowledge of that specific dog's response range, and she pressed 2 fingers flat against the center of Flint's sternum. Not gripping, not restraining, just contact. A specific location, a specific pressure. Then she tapped the crown of his skull with her knuckle. Once. Twice more in immediate succession. Flint stopped. Not wound down, not gradually calmed, stopped, as though a circuit had been interrupted. His haunches dropped, his barking choked into silence, and he sat, fully sat, weight settled, muscles released, and pressed the full side of his body against Audrey's knee. He exhaled, long and slow. Grant lay completely still. He had seen that gesture exactly once in his career. It was at a classified briefing in 2019, a joint session between FBI RICO assets and the U.S. EMS Special Operations Group, when the Marshals were integrating their protection dog units into federal witness security operations. The briefing had covered a specialized deprogramming technique for protection canines working in close proximity silence during active WITSEC movements, situations where a verbal command would expose the operation. The two-finger sternum press, combined with the specific triple-tap skull sequence, had been demonstrated by a USMS SOG handler. It was never filed in any publicly accessible document. It was never shared with agencies outside the integration program. It existed in the working memory of, at most, 100 people on Earth. One of them was currently kneeling on his bedroom floor, wearing a faded green fleece. Audrey stood. She adjusted Flint's collar with a practiced pull. She looked at Grant. His eyes were closed. His breathing was slow and even. He had been fast enough. She confirmed the deer through the window, then returned to the kitchen. Flint climbed back onto the foot of the bed. He did not look at the window again. He looked at the doorway through which Audrey had disappeared, and he exhaled a second time, quieter, something that sounded, if Grant was not imagining it, like relief. The next morning, Grant waited until Audrey left for her midday supply run into town. Then he called Delia Orme. Delia had been his evidence analyst for 11 years. She was retired now, but still held the access codes she wasn't technically supposed to have, and she still answered when Grant called. "I need a ghost protocol check," he said. "Audrey Kell, licensed physical therapist, employed by Sentinel Home Care out of Missoula. I need everything before 36 months ago." Delia was quiet for a moment. "This is the aid Nelson arranged?" "The same. Give me an hour." She called back in 42 minutes. "Grant." Her voice was careful in the particular way that meant she was measuring how much to say and in what order. "Before I tell you about the woman, I ran her through biometrics as a matter of course. The FBI database returned a hit, heavily redacted, that kicked me out of the system before I could read the full record. But I got the header. Joint Interagency Task Force, Narcotics." Grant said nothing. "JATFN," Delia continued. "International Cartel Dismantling. The kind of unit that doesn't appear in budget hearings." A pause. "Her background before the nursing license is a wall. She becomes a real person 28 months ago. Before that, nothing. She's a manufactured identity, Grant. High quality but manufactured." "And Nelson?" Grant asked. His voice was very quiet. There was a longer pause. "I ran his financials while I was in the system. I wasn't looking for anything. I was being thorough." Delia's next breath was audible. "He's carrying $1.4 million in debt to a shell company incorporated in the Cayman Islands. The corporate structure routes through 3 holding companies before landing in an account tied to a commercial import business in Sonora, Mexico. The Salazar network ran its domestic finances through commercial import fronts in Sonora, Mexico." Grant had written that into a case file 11 years ago. He had given that case file to Nelson Cray to hold in his private trust document storage, because Grant had not trusted the FBI server, because Grant had been cautious, because he had thought caution was enough. "Delia," he said, "can you come out here?" "I'm already in the car," she said. 6 hours. That evening, Audrey arrived at 7. She set her supply bag on the kitchen table and turned to find Grant sitting in his wheelchair by the window, watching the dark tree line at the edge of the property. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "The USMS Special Operations Group," Grant said. "I kept trying to place it, but JATFN wouldn't farm to the marshals. Too territorial. A dedicated attachment within FBI structure, maybe. Something that doesn't appear in the org chart." The room went very still. Audrey's posture changed, not dramatically, not the way a person collapses when they're caught, but the way a held breath releases. The performance of ordinary dissolved. "You made contact with someone," she said. "Not a question." "I called an old colleague." Audrey closed her eyes for one flat second. "Before or after I left for supplies?" "Before." "Grant." She set her hands on her knees. "If you called anyone with a federal network connection, that call was visible. And if it was visible, then whoever has been monitoring your communications knows this cover is compromised." She held his gaze. "We don't have much time." "Then tell me who you work for and what you know about Nelson Cray." She did. The Salazar network had operated domestic legal infrastructure in the Pacific Northwest for over a decade. Attorneys, accountants, logistics managers embedded inside legitimate businesses. Nelson Cray had been their primary legal counsel since 2015, 2 years before he became Grant's personal attorney. He had passed case intelligence to the network throughout the entirety of Grant's RICO investigation: the raid routes, the timing, the communication frequencies. In exchange, the network absorbed his debts that had started at $400,000 and compounded over 7 years into the figure they had become. The car bomb had been the network's response to learning that Grant retained hard copies of his case files. Physical documentation he had kept off the FBI server, documentation that named Cray as the domestic liaison who had routed shipments through 3 West Coast ports. Those files still existed, in a waterproof lockbox inside the property's root cellar. Cray had known about them. He had told the network. He had been managing Grant's recovery, his isolation, and his precise location ever since the bombing, reporting it back like a daily status update. He had been at Grant's hospital bedside in the ICU. He had held Grant's hand. JATFN embedded me through the Sentinel home care referral before Cray made contact with the agency, Audrey said. We were inside the pipeline before he placed the call. My mandate was to keep you alive, document his operational communications, and build a case against the network's domestic structure. She paused. You complicated that by making contact with your federal network. The root cellar files, Grant said. I'll move them now. Audrey stood. That was when Flint's head swung toward the front of the house. Her tactical watch vibrated once. She checked the face. Motion at the north fence. 3 vehicles running dark. Her voice dropped into a register Grant had not heard from her in 3 weeks. Flat, operational, stripped of all unnecessary weight. They're not here to negotiate. She pulled the Sig Sauer P320 from a hidden panel behind the guest room closet with the ease of someone retrieving a tool they have used many times. She handed Grant his pistol from the gun safe. She'd known the combination since week 2, she confirmed, without apology. She braced the front door with a steel bar that had been riding inside her supply bag for 21 days, masquerading as a therapy prop. Grant positioned himself behind the reinforced pine table in the main room. Clear sightline down the hallway, solid wall at his back. His left hand was useless. His right hand was steady. Flint, Audrey said, and gave a flat palm push forward, the send command. The dog dropped into a hunting crouch and melted into the dark kitchen without a sound. The front door took 3 hits from a battering ram before the frame began to splinter. The steel brace held through all 3. They came through the kitchen window instead. The first man was still clearing the sill when Flint hit him. The dog took his forearm in a grip that could bend rebar, and the 2 of them went to the floor in a controlled catastrophe of impact and thrashing. The second man swung his carbine toward Susant. He never completed the arc. Audrey stepped from the hallway behind him, applied a choke that cut blood flow in 4 seconds, and guided him to the floor without drama. Ouse, she said quietly. Flint released and stepped back, pressing his flank against her leg, his breath ragged, blood on his muzzle. A third man was at the back porch, hands on the sliding glass door. Grant steadied his pistol on the table's edge. Right hand, 2-point contact, the discipline of 3 decades of range time cutting clean through the pain and the adrenaline, and fired twice. The man dropped and did not move. Silence, then the wind. Audrey stepped out the front door. Headlights swept the driveway as a black SUV tried to reverse toward the gate. She fired 2 controlled shots into the rear tires. The vehicle lurched into the fence post and stopped. The passenger door opened. Nelson Cray climbed out with both hands raised, wearing a down vest and the particular expression of a man who has calculated wrong about something important and is only now beginning to understand what that means. Grant came out onto the porch. Flint walked beside him. Cray was on his knees in the frozen gravel. His breath came in visible puffs in the cold night air. Grant, he said. Grant, listen to me. They had leverage. The debt, the network. By the time I understood what I'd walked into, there was no clean exit. I had a family. I had a practice. They owned every piece of it. He reached a hand out. You know me. You know I never. Sandra Reyes had a daughter who just started kindergarten, Grant said. His voice was completely flat. Marcus Timmons coached Little League on Saturday mornings. Kevin Park was 2 years from his pension. He looked at Cray for a long, careful moment. This man had sat beside him at Kevin Park's funeral, had taken Park's widow's hands in both of his, and told her he was so sorry for her loss. You knew the roots. You gave them everything. Cray's outstretched hand dropped. His mouth worked, but nothing came. Grant turned away. He didn't want to watch what came next. He didn't want any part of whatever was left to feel. He's yours, he said quietly to Audrey. Audrey stepped forward. She spoke into her comm unit. Target secured. Ground team, you're clear. Request federal transport and notification to the U.S. Attorney's Office. We have the domestic liaison in custody. Get a medical team for the men inside. She paused. And tell Delia Orm's escort to bring her through. We'll need her testimony on the financial chain. She turned to look at Grant. For the first time in 3 weeks, something moved beneath the operational surface of her face. Not warmth, exactly. More like acknowledgement, the recognition one person extends to another, who has just passed through something that cannot be summarized or made smaller by being named. Your colleague is 30 miles out, Audrey said. She'll be here soon. Federal vehicles came through the gate in a quiet convoy, their headlights sweeping across the frozen pasture. Cray was put into a transport with his hands behind his back. 2 members of the tactical team's medical element went inside for the men on the kitchen floor. Flint sat at Grant's side and watched the vehicles methodically, tracking each one as it found its position. Then, the dog looked up at Audrey. What happened next was difficult to describe to anyone who had not spent time around a working dog. It wasn't affection. Flint didn't wag his tail, didn't press his nose into her palm. He simply looked at her for a sustained moment with the kind of attention that has no agenda behind it. Then he looked at Grant, then back at her. And he lay down across both their feet. Grant exhaled. It was, he realized, the first full breath he had drawn since the parking structure. Since the flash and the concussion and the ringing silence that followed, and the long months of everything after. Audrey extended her hand. Not downward, the way a therapist offers a hand to a patient who needs help rising. Outward level, the way one person extends a hand to another, they have decided to stand beside. Grant took it. The federal team moved efficiently around them in the cold. Somewhere out in the dark timber, a great horned owl called once and went quiet. Flint stayed where he was, patient and perfectly still, his weight distributed evenly across both pairs of boots, as though settling a question he had been working on for 21 days. He'd understood what Audrey was almost from the beginning. He just hadn't been certain, until tonight, which side of a very old line she was standing on. He had decided it was the right one. Grant supposed that made the dog the sharper judge of the two. He didn't mind. He had always known Flint was smarter than him about the things that mattered most. Did Audrey's quiet courage and Flint's unbreakable instincts keep you riveted from the first moment to the last? The bond between a working dog and the people he chooses to protect runs deeper than training. It runs through something that cannot be manufactured or faked. If this story of hidden loyalty, devastating betrayal, and the courage it takes to trust again meant something to you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Kind Tales for more stories about the people and the animals who show up when it matters most.